Good afternoon to everyone, everywhere. Today is a very special day because it is the Monday after the Feast of the Holy Trinity. And what we are going to do now follows the Holy Trinity. All our research seminars at Triertium explore the theological transformation of philosophy. And today we will discuss the theological transformation of logic. May this be seen as the scholarly echo of yesterday's celebration. As our guest today, American philosopher and theologian Dr. Ryan Haecker will present his new book, Restoring Reason, Theology of Logic in Origen of Alexandria. The book is the second volume in the new series, Studies on Triadic Ontology and Trinitarian Philosophy, published by Verlag Karl Alber. The entire series stems from a renewed interest in Trinitarian ontology that culminated in the 2019 New Trinitarian Ontologies Conference in Cambridge. The conference was originally initiated by John Milbank and co-organized by Dr. Ryan Haecker, among others. I'm truly delighted to welcome Dr. Haecker among us, as we have been collaborating for several years since we first met in Cambridge. Dr. Ryan Haecker studied history, philosophy, and theology at the University of Texas, the University of Würzburg, and the University of Nottingham. He received his PhD in theology and religious studies from Peterhouse, University of Cambridge. His doctoral studies were supervised by Rowan Williams. Dr. Haecker is a fellow of the American Academy in Rome and the author of the forthcoming book, Restoring Reason. He is going to present now. Ryan, welcome to Olomouc, and we are eager to hear the good news about the logic and your book.
Good afternoon, everyone. Greetings to those here in the room and those who are joining us online. This book began as a theological investigation with an historical focus on the 3rd century Christian theologian Origen of Alexandria. It explores the way that Origen had used logic as a guide for scientifically demonstrating Christian doctrine, and most of all, the doctrine of the Holy Trinity. The Trinity is championed here as the principle first of logic, but finally of ontology, or of metaphysics, or of that which is, so as to show the hidden shape of all that can be and all that can be known. To ascend, however, to these highest of ideas, we must begin by exploring the elements of discovery from that which is simple to that which is most complex. Logic is the art of reason to know that which is true. More than metaphysics, it is studied for the purpose of preserving the true and producing the necessary judgments of science at each advance of knowledge. The word logike was first used by the ancient Stoics as a contraction of the word logos to designate the part of philosophy that investigates the meaning of words, or logoi, and the use of arguments, and most especially the syllogism, which is the form of showing through a valid form of reasoning what must be so. Like writing, the danger of logic is that it can become a way of forgetting how to argue of what we know and what we find within the world. When left to gather the world to itself, it appears to collect all there is along the fissures of its own in barren abstract forms. The suppression of the leaps of faith under this mnemonic computer of automated knowing tends to collapse recollection of the past into a percussive repetition of a more anxious present. And so long, it seems, as logic remains separate from God, theology can never demonstrate its conclusions, and logic may never come to know its highest truths. However, the basic questions of logic concern more than simply mnemonic computers for calculating arguments. It is essentially concerned with the form of knowing truth itself, of theory as well as practice, and in action of the evaluation of not only what is, but what ought to be. As Ludwig Wittgenstein once remarked, quote, "Logic is not a body of doctrine, but a mirror image of the world. The world and life are one. Ethics and aesthetics are one. Logic is transcendental," end quote. Even so, this claim of transcendental reason must fall into the innermost chambers of our hearts, for it concerns not simply what should be regarded as true for some people here or in some far distant country, but what it is that we believe to be absolutely true for ourselves. The truths of logic are nothing if not our own, nothing if not our own most truths. As I was reminded recently by my friend Ilma Bogdan, the test of logic is whether it answers to these highest questions of the human heart. In contrast to ancient and modern formal logics from Aristotle to Frege, the logic of Christian theology can be speculatively rehabilitated as more true precisely because it is more radically Trinitarian and Christological. Following the canonic emptying of generative universality and the theandric union of absolute universality and concrete singularity in the person of Christ, the sacred logic of Christian doctrine, or Sacra Doctrina, arises from each singular response of the human heart to a higher calling to know that which is true, from the eventual disclosure of the gospel story, and within it, of an analysis of scripture that is informed by systematic and dialectical logic. In contrast to the unrequited tragedy of dialectic spinning in circles without saving truth, we can recall in the biblical story of the gift of the wisdom of Solomon, how the learning of philosophers, whether in metaphysics or in logic, is more ultimately a gift that calls for a counter gift of escalating learning, and the gift that Origen had once recognized, called for a what he called divine proof, that is written not simply with the ink quill of the philosophers, but with the blood of the martyrs, with syllogisms of life-giving stone and the sources of unforgettable learning. The first seed of this book arose in this way from a desire to discover a new answer to the permanent questions and dangers of religious amnesia. That is, the spell of forgetfulness that conceals both our divine origin and our higher supernatural destiny under a cloud of false gnosis, whether that be in logic or in mechanics. Like a latter-day John Hanning Speke, I sought to find the source of the Nile that had given birth to both the earliest expressions of what we now call Trinitarian ontology, as well as its competition from Plotinus to Proclus, and the sources from which to renew this hidden spiritual life. At the crossroads of the religions and philosophies of the future, Alexandria was the capital of the Hellenistic world. It had been conceived by Alexander the Great as the philosophical project. As a student of Aristotle, he had, by his global conquests and the efforts of Ptolemy, singularly bequeathed the intellectual legacy of the empire to his eponymous city in Egypt. After flourishing for many centuries, it would become the cradle of three world historical currents: Neo-Pythagoreanism, Hellenistic Judaism, and Christian theology. At the apex of ante-Nicene speculation, the Alexandrian synthesis of scriptural interpretation and systematic philosophy was distinguished by the first dialectical exchange of Christian thinkers with the great philosophical schools of the imperial Roman era. In Alexandria, Pantaenus, Clement, and Origen were contemporaries of Numenius, Plotinus, and Porphyry, whose parallel influence will continue to shape the major currents of late antique philosophy in and beyond the 529 AD closure of the Academy of Athens. And in Origen's Contra Celsum and Porphyry's Adversus Christianus, we can hear echoes that still resonate today of this first polemical conflict between Neoplatonic philosophy and Christian and Trinitarian theology, a conflict which is already framed by Origen and his contemporary Plotinus. Origen of Alexandria was the most comprehensive and encyclopedic of the Alexandrian fathers. He has been acknowledged by ancient and modern readers alike as the culminating figure of ante-Nicene and Alexandrian Christian theology. St. Jerome, the translator of the Latin Vulgate Bible, called him the father of the fathers of the church, and Adamantius, that is the man of diamonds. Joseph Tixerot aptly summarizes, quote, Origen is undoubtedly the greatest of theologians, a man of knowledge truly universal, who possessed all learning of his time, a soul eminently upright and sincere, a mind capable of possessing all learning of his time, of synthetic and general views, end quote. Hans Urs Balthasar had endeavored to rehabilitate the fire and spirit of Origen as a doctor of the church of the same stature as Augustine and Aquinas. In both the East and the West, the Latin Catholic resource walk movement of the return to the sources and the Greek Orthodox neo-patristic movement of a synthesis of the fathers has recalled Origen as the oldest source of Christian philosophical theology. This book asks how Origen's logic can be interpreted for Origen's theology in a theological interpretation of logic, which I propose we should call a theology of logic. Theology of logic announces a new way to study the sources and subject of logic for theology. It asks the absolute question, not only of how logic operates, but of why logic shows that which is true. It reflects upon the formula of argument to discover the divine origin and purpose of logic. It should accordingly be doubly distinguished on the one hand from theoretical or philosophical logic, which asks what are the rules of logic, and on the other hand from practical or applied logic, which asks how these rules of logic can be used to demonstrate certain conclusions. It interrogates the beginning and end of logic before any adverse separation of logic from theology, and it starts with no original presupposition of the mechanical necessity of the syllogism for the production of scientific knowledge, but radically asks the higher theological question of why logic should be true at all. This book has been written as a Christian apology for reason. Reason is the power of the mind to move from one thought to the next. It has, from Anaxagoras to Hegel, been conceived as one part of the divine intellect that moves the stars. Yet in recent centuries, this divine gift has increasingly come to be regarded with increasing suspicion. The capture of speech in writing, the calculation of argument in mathematical logic, and the automation of calculation in digital computers has recently caused reason to be despised by many as a sterile rhetoric of cognitive domination. Hence, the Enlightenment hope that we could know the simple essences of things now seems as but a sunlit memory that can no longer shine through the clouds of conflicting opinions. And the gospel promise that, quote, nothing is secret that shall not be made manifest, end quote, seems day by day to be slowly suffocating, less from insurmountable difficulties inherent in the nature of reason itself, and more from an accumulated weariness of knowing too much and thinking too little. Yet if this suspicion of reason has arisen from a loss of attention to that which is highest in holiness, the chains that we have cast around our own thoughts can again be unlocked by that same hidden and mysterious strength. Origen of Alexandria will in this book be shown to have developed the first Christian theology of logic. His theological interpretation of logic will be read as a guide to recollect the logic that is unique and specific to Christian theology, that is the form of knowing in answer to the call of revelation. He has, beginning in his systematic theology on first principles, interpreted logic as a simulation of the divine logos communicated by Christ in and from the three divine persons of God the Son and the Holy Spirit. And he has in his scriptural commentary shown how, beginning in what he calls the spiritual sense, the rational science of logic is virtually interwoven in and through the spiritual sense, that is, in and through the apoptic, the more than visible or the mystical science of theology. Since it is intertwined with the mystical, logic is not a complete and separate science of pure a priori mechanics. For the originary construction of its elements, of its elementary forms, is shaped in answer to the divine word or logos, and the communication of the logos from the Son to the Father through the Spirit, and the circulation of this logic of the logos in and from its highest center. The archike triados, that is, the three principles, is the central triadic circuit of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, who are all together united in one simple intellectual being. Since in this circuit, logic is simulated from the logos is an attribute or epinoia of the Son, and all the attributes of the Son are communicated to the Father through the Spirit, logic is created in the world, even as it is communicated in and by the divine intellect, nous, and word logos, or of the Son of God. Since finally, all three persons of the Trinity act as one in the creation of the world and of its being, this Trinitarian logic must ultimately constitute a Trinitarian ontology. This study examines Origen's use of logic to recollect how logic should be used for the purpose of scientifically proving the beliefs of Christian theology. It shares with On First Principles the ambition to, in Origen's words, quote, confirm our belief with reason, end quote, and to, quote, construct a certain structure of the body of all these theological topics in accordance with reason, end quote. Yet in answer to the critical challenge of modern logic, it further reflects upon how Origen interprets and uses logic to demonstrate the articles of Christian doctrine. Its dual focus is partly philosophical and partly historical. Its philosophical subject is theology of logic, and its historical topic is Origen of Alexandria. It will accordingly delve further into the evidence of history so as to ascend higher and take flight among the universal ideas of philosophy. Its aim will be to uncover the ancestral sources for a renewal of confidence in what Clement of Alexandria once dubbed Christian gnosis, that is, the belief that all that can be known shall be known in the fullness of time, in the eschatological hope of the Spirit overcoming sources of alienation and despair. This book endeavors to recall from among the writings of Origen of Alexandria the earliest Christian theological interpretation of logic. It will seek not only the simulations of, but the originary source of logic itself. will be distinguished by its leap of absolute reflection upon the revelatory origin and religious purpose of logic. And it will consequently recommend a sacred logic of systematic theology in which these hyperbolic arcs of dialectical circuits leap beyond the simulated ambit of secular reason. The secular will here be considered as a closed sphere of reason that holds any regime of understanding to constitute the sufficient truth of the world. The fault of secular reason will be argued to result from its reduction into nihilism, that is, a reductio ad nihilo. For if being or substance comes from nothing but itself and captures the totality of both thought and being, then the simulated ground of secular reason must be utterly contingent, voluntary, and bereft of ultimate or higher foundations. Yet in contrast to the pious nostrums that seek to simply escape from this world of logic as of simulated learning, this book will celebrate the speculative advances that have been achieved by logic under the plane of its artificial coherence. It will not despise logic, but find a way to incorporate and use logic for higher ends. It will look to find how once these have been concentrated in pure forms of logic, the simulation of speech and argument can then be freely released to leap in the poetics of the liturgy. For the forms of logic will be shown to be not abstract but concrete, saturated with vital, affective, and sensuous content. Expressly in the sacraments and uniquely in the Eucharist, there remains no lasting deferral of truth. Rather, it can, in recollecting the incarnate Logos, cancel this deferral from the theoretical truth to the practical efficacy and share its meaning without reserve. As a community of recollecting the incarnate Logos, from which logic begins, the Church can at last be regarded as the hidden center of the use of logic on earth, the helmsman at the bark of St. Peter that commands the ship of the world. This book makes a daring wager. If theology is the ground of logic, then Origen's logic should be read for Origen's theology. Until now, Origen's logic has been read apart from his metaphysical ground in his system of theology, and the progressive formalization of logic as secular has suppressed its revelatory origin and its hidden religious purpose. In contrast to all schools of ancient and modern logic, Origen has conceived of logic as a simulation in argument that is spoken of as created in and from the incarnate Logos. The canonic descent of the divine Logos describes the universal forms of logic in the particular construction of the world. As the world is consummated in an absolute and singular mediator, whose teachings thereafter become the central Wittgenstein of all subsequent logical investigations. In concentric hermeneutical circuits, the judgments of scriptural analysis are then assumed as the authoritative premises in the analytical demonstrations of systematic theology. And in his system of theology, the hermeneutical and dialectical circuits of scriptural interpretation and systematic theology ultimately converge upon Christ the Son at the center of the Church. From this Christological center, the elementary forms of logic are radically shaped by the filial procession of the Son, of the Father, from the Father, and through the Holy Spirit, in triadic circuits that share by participation in the three-in-one relations of the Holy Trinity. Origen's logic must for this reason be considered a Trinitarian logic, in which the simulated forms of logic imminently reflect the triadic circuits of thought and being that circulate in and form this highest center. The restoration of the world once promised in the gospel now waits for us to carry on in the spiritual progress of human reason. It will for this purpose be spoken of in a telescopic sense as both proximately the remedy of each cognitive lapse into unreason, but more absolutely as the reunion of all dispersed intellects become one in the knowledge and love of God. The complete salvific circuit from the creation to the restoration is eternally centered upon the canonic descent of the divine Logos in time, such that through the recollection of the Church, its secret inheritance can ever again be rediscovered in successive currents of history. In contrast to all previous genealogies of the secular, the essential caesura in the progressive formalization of logic will be shown to result neither from the rupture of the concept in dialectic after Shelley and Hegel, nor from the break of the bonds of participation in the analogy of being after Duns Scotus and William Ockham, but rather and more metaphysically and mythically from the historic recapitulation of the primordial fall that has lately sown the poison seeds for so many arguments that conclude without the air of living truth. This book will stage again the drama of the gospel and the history of logic, where secular histories of logic pass through successive epochs of its progressive formalization to elevate the timeless forms of logic beyond the content of revelation. This sacred history of logic will re-narrate successive acts of the sublimation of formal logic into what he will describe as the hyperbolic or hyperlogic of Christian and systematic theology. The history of logic will be shown to echo the dramatic oscillations of the Gospels. Quote, in the beginning was the Word, end quote, and was pregnant with every conceivable form of logic, the totality of all plural and possible logics, as well as the ultimate logic that holds them together and guides them to the highest end. Yet after the fall of reason into abstract formality, quote, the world knew him not, and in forgetting has suppressed the so-called foolishness of God under the wisdom of the world. This retelling of the book of Genesis in the Gospel of John will, as an Origin of Alexandria, be repeated differently, not in the canonic recreation of the world, but rather after its apparent triumph, in the simulation of its formal constitution, in the rupture of secular in opposition to sacred and ecclesial reason. In recalling this primordial fault from the eternal past, it will find its effects repeated differently in successive epochs of history. The sources of this genealogy will accordingly be drawn from the primordial beginning of Christian theology, before Charles Taylor's medieval reform narrative and before John Wilbank's Franciscan charism narrative, and will present a counter genealogy, not of how these effects can be momentarily elided, but in a more decisive strategy of how the logical constitution of the secular can at last be theologically overcome. So the book is structured in 8 chapters, and these chapters form a kind of 3 stages of a trilogy. So the first and concluding chapters, 1 and 8, constitute the introduction and the conclusion, which introduce the themes, stage the critical intervention, and the conclusion also recapitulate those, as well as showing their relevance for not only systematic theology, but also for dialectical mathematical logic. The central 6 chapters are structured in 3 acts. The central one is the historical act, which concerns Origin of Alexandria. It's divided on the one hand between a commentary on first principles, which I believe is the first full-length commentary on first principles in the English language. So it should be very exciting, but also written from a higher theological point of view with the ambition to show the logical coherence of Origen's introduction to systematic theology, its first catechetical effort to teach and demonstrate the doctrines of Christian theology. The second part being commentaries on the Gospel of John and the Song of Songs, as well as an attempt to show what Origen had attempted to achieve apologetically with Contra Celsum, and in doing so also an attempt to show how the fullness of the spiritual sense is consummated in the logic of love, the way by which, as it were, the gift of love is shared through the Holy Spirit, through the church, in the effort of coming to know that which is in the source of love itself, that is God who is love. Now, what stands immediately beyond that are two beyond the exegetical chapter is 2 philosophical chapters. And in these philosophical chapters, I attempt, on the one hand, to introduce the hermeneutical standpoint of Origin of Alexandria, his spiritual hermeneutic, that is, the way by which he interrogates not only the Gospels through the higher heart of the Spirit, that is, an attempt to find their inner coherence that can't be ruptured across Old and New Testament or across really successive books or disparate works, but is altogether held together from within by single authorship, but one that also calls upon the endless creativity of the human heart. That is, I try to present a overcoming, on the one hand, of a merely formalist hermeneutic that would derive an a priori matrix that would prescribe in advance how the scripture, as well as everything that can be read, should be read in advance. Or on the other hand, what I describe as an anti-formalist hermeneutic, which in the works of Martin Heidegger, Jacques Derrida, and to another extent in Hans Urs von Gadamer, attempts to recommend successive leaps of supplemental alternatives, that is, whether from the standpoint of being or of writing, that would give us an alternative way of entering into the reading of scripture, the reading of anything at all, ultimately the way of thinking. I even engage with what I describe as an anti-formal logic, which is the complemental alternative to logic that is developed from Gottlob Frege, that is situated on the standpoint of this infinite succession of supplements. Now, the counterpoint to this question of historicism and hermeneutics is also an interrogation of the use of analysis in modern analytic philosophy. So it's an attempt to show how Origen can be defended on the one hand from his continental critics, those who despise, as it were, the theology and hermeneutics of the Logos, who regard it as a principle of forgetfulness, and on the other hand, the attempt by so-called analytic theologians to overcode the possibility of genuinely philosophically engaged patristic and Trinitarian ontology with another a priori form of argument that in this case is conceived as a kind of abstract mnemonic computer, which I characterize as the pure analytic. The pure analytic here is a idea of calculation of all analytical inferences that results from the analysis of language into logic, and ultimately into a form of logic that stands upon itself in a way that momentarily is operative in first order logic, but ultimately incompletable, but before which that incompletability calls for its continual reorchestration and its redevelopment and redeployment. And argue that Origen of Alexandria has a superior way of thinking about analysis, one that is not rooted in the simulated form of abstract reason, rather is ultimately rooted in systematic theology and the life-giving source of all reason that comes from the divine logos that's shared with the Holy Spirit, with the church, and the collective efforts of all the church, all of humanity, and searching for, across the arts and sciences, for ways by which we can come to know the world better. And the last two chapters are historical. That is chapters 2 and chapter 3 and chapter 6. And they are a prior and posterior analysis of logic from an Origenian standpoint. That is, one is an attempt to think before Origen to the sources of logic, beginning with Parmenides, Gorgias, and Plato, continuing through Aristotle, through Theophrastus and Chrysippus in ancient formal logic, and then even beyond ancient formal logic to what I characterize as hyperlogic, which begins with Philo, Clement, and Origen. And this hyperlogic assumes a hyperbolic standpoint to logic, where the principles of logic prescind from the principles that are the ground of logic. In this case, they would be the divine nous, divine mind, or divine logos, that is, the divine word by which the world was created. And in the posterior genealogy of logic, I trace that narrative onward after Origen, examining the Origenist controversies as a pivotal caesura for both the forgetfulness of Origen as well as for the dislocation of Christian theology from its logical roots. And then I continue the narrative by tracing the origin of secular logic in medieval philosophy and show that although it has its point of rupture in late medieval thought, specifically in the writings of Duns Scotus and William of Ockham, that it can in another way be shown to have reemerged from a misrecollection of Aristotle's logic as separate from his metaphysics and from his theology. So as soon as you try to, as the Stoics have done, regard logic as though it's a scholastic device for coming to invent new knowledge without recollecting that knowledge or without deriving it from its mythic and divine foundations, then you begin to regard logic as though it can, as it were, create something from nothing, or as though it's an engine for the cognitive mastery of the world that can create anything from the bare resources of the world. And I argue that this is the origin of what I call secular logic that has denied its ultimate theological foundations as well as its mythic purpose and religious function. And from that, I trace a number of countervailing currents, both in German idealism and Romanticism, that in some ways recapitulate, sometimes attempt to escape from this secular dynamic, but for which we find ourselves in the early 20th century in the moment of logical positivism that attempts to frame all that can be known under a computational matrix whose principle is the principle of analysis itself, with a pure analytic. And so to escape from that assumption that everything that can be known has to be analyzed in this computational framework, I have presented Origen of Alexandria as a means for escape. And having reflected upon it for many years and having written a number of papers and articles since then, I've increasingly recognized that the conflict here is not so much between formal logic and dialectical or hyperlogic or sacred logic, but with a way of thinking about logic that tries to capture the world in forms of thought that are immediately evident to us and that fall under the framework of technical domination. And this is in another way of saying that it's an attempt to dominate the world through the power of change and motion. That is trying to, as it were, like Prometheus, wrest divine power within human hands and then use that in a kind of Luciferian way to refashion the world in our own prideful image. So the attempt here is to show how not only logic, but in another way also mechanics or cybernetics or computers become the occasion for the same struggle, for the same spiritual battle against the titans that would dominate the world with their cognitive efforts and their prideful will. And my later work that has followed from this book, that I've written in a number of articles on spiritual cybernetics and sacramental engines, in which I hope to conclude with a forthcoming chapter on Jesuit cybernetics, is an attempt to find within it the spirit of life and also the mythic origins from which we can find new ways to discover that hidden truth that was buried not only under the forms of logic, but also increasingly under the weight of mechanics and the abstract cybernetic engines that haunt and dwell over on our world. So with all that said, I think Origen is still an answer to many of these problems of false gnosis and of the imperial powers that stand above us and that threaten to undermine and deprive us the possibility of witnessing and answering to the call of the Gospels, to the possibility of sacrificial charity and life-giving truth. The essential questions of logic have, in the course of this work, shown to pass over to those of theology. For as Jesus teaches, the highest purpose of logic and religion are one, to, quote, know the truth that sets our spirit free. The principle of reason can no longer be held captive in a simulated matrix of barren forms, but rather, and in the most vibrant of ways, the life and spirit that once breathed upon the formless waters of all collapsing formal systems. Pure formal thought must pass from the suppression of feeling and the suspension of reason to this higher plateau of the spirit, in which feeling is as knowable as reason is desirable. This higher way of knowledge of God is now open to us, for it stands for us not as it has been denied by secular reason, as an unsearchable mind that stands behind the highest firmament of the outermost night. Rather, this veil of ignorance has been torn asunder, knowledge of it has been given to us, and no obstacle now remains to halt our advance to come to know, and even as we are known, by he who knows all that dare to know. At this absolute middle, Trinitarian ontology begins with what seems the simplest and richest of philosophical questions. It asks the simplest question of what is being, as it may yet be answered in faith with the absolute question of what is God. And it speaks with Aristotle of what simply is, so as to speak with Augustine of the creative cause of all being. It affirms the participation or methexis of being proceeding in and from the first principles of Christian theology. It thus announces a strategic reversal of any secular privileging of the ontological apart from the higher ground of theology. To be religious today, oh, I'm sorry, I lost a page here. Well, I don't know what I'll do. I guess I'll skip that page then, I'm sorry. We'll have to go on. To be religious today is often to be strange, to summon forces unheard of, and even to embody them. If we are to dare to know, we must ask the central questions of Christianity, the Trinity, and its ontology in a new way. We must dare to challenge the titans of cosmotechnical domination, whose inhuman pantheon of demonic powers circles the skies in starlit satellites of radio communication and linger within the virtual spaces of algorithmic routines that increasingly regulate our lives. We must ask the oldest question, not only of what should be the way to knowledge, but why it is true at all. For it is only in searching that we shall find, and only in the myth that knowledge is more gift than invention, more an awakening to the sacrificial fire of charity than a Promethean theft of cognitive power, that we can discover the hidden sources from which to love the life that will leap again.
Thank you so much, Ryan. Thank you. It was, of course, fascinating. I think you have explicated or at least indicated so many extremely important topics related, on the one hand, to the history of theology, and on the other hand, to the very contemporary problems and crises. We have some time for our questions and your answers. Are there any remarks or questions online, so we can prefer first those who are not at the place?
Sorry, I have a question. Is it possible to get a physical, not a physical copy, but like of this presentation?
Could you repeat your question? Are you asking if it's possible to have a summary of the presentation or a copy of this presentation?
Yes, well, just the text that you just read.
So I can share that later. Although
Okay,
I think it repeats what's in my book, so maybe the publishers won't like that. But
okay,
I'll share the presentation online later. Perhaps that will help you if you can. Oh, we can always talk about it later if you like. Perhaps if there's any thoughts about do share them now, or perhaps we can discuss them at some later time.
Yes. Yeah. No, I think it's I will probably have to get the book at some point, but I will just have to convince my wife to buy even more books.
Oh, right. Yes, that is always a challenge.
So,
just as a note, I in fact did not miss a page. I simply had put the page down the wrong way, so sorry about that. I had gotten confused briefly, but you did not miss content.
Excellent. So we wish you that you will be successful in motivating your wife to buy it. Are there any other questions from the audience online? Please. Petr.
Yeah, and Stanley might stole that too. So maybe I will give priority to Stanley and we'll go on later.
So I had one question, apart from how to get the book, is you mentioned that you aren't interested in the, or you're not talking about the sort of philosophical side of logic and the mechanics of it, but there are currently like different theories about exactly what logic is, and I'm wondering if you think that your analysis has implications for whether certain things are better theories. In other words, like does this advantage logical expressivism or some other theory that's on the table at the moment?
Brilliant. Yes, this is a very important question. So on the one hand, a purely theological interpretation of logic that was simply mythical, or that, as it were, abstracted to a plane in which it looked for the concordance with Christian doctrine, would be quite useless to philosophy of logic and practicing logicians, and so it wouldn't, as it were, advance anything in logic. On the other hand, we shouldn't presume that the Christian revelation and the doctrinal elaboration of it is itself logic, or that it shows us, as it were, the inner mechanics of logic. So it's important to distinguish a theological approach to logic, which is a higher level of reflection upon the origin, sources, and purpose of logic, from the philosophy of logic, which asks philosophical questions of which is the best form of logic, and how we formulate logic, and how does we build logic from the ground up, as well as applied logic, which is simply, as it were, the following through of the forms of logic in argument and analysis. So it doesn't claim to be a philosophy of logic, but it also doesn't claim to be a relevant philosophy of logic. And the reason is this, that if logic is about that which is true, and ultimately about the truth of the world that is discovered through a variety of media, whether it be through revelation or through prayer or practice, as well as with the ultimate concern for that it should be so, that the truth of the world should conform to our obligations within, obligations we owe to one another, our ethical life as well as our scientific life, then what I recommend is that the study of theology should inform and guide the activity of philosophy of logic as well as its application. So in this sense, what I'm recommending is something like the relevance of theology to metaphysics or physics. That is, theology itself doesn't prescribe the answers to metaphysics per se. It recommends certain answers to them that conform to the truth of revelation and the truth that has been, as it were, discovered through the corporate community that has received that and been informed by that in their prayer life and their charitable works. And in another way, it doesn't tell us, for instance, how to think of physics. It doesn't tell us, for instance, how to guide rockets to Pluto or to how to devise, for instance, a cure for cancer. But it does recommend more felicitous and, you might say, life-affirming practices that are conducive to truth. And so one of the ways in which I argue that theology informs logic is that it provides a goal for the truth and practice of logic. So it provides an answer to, as well, what the ethical obligations are in using logic. But it also suggests that there are some forms of logic that are more commensurate with the doctrinal development of Christian theology, with the, as it were, the witness of the saints and the mystics, that would otherwise be inexplicable by logic. So for instance, if you had a logic that was unable to communicate of or prove the truth of certain ideas that had come down and cherished in the history of philosophy, that could be a standpoint either for rejecting it as meaningless, for instance, as A.J. Ayers and logical positives had, or it could be an occasion to reflect upon whether there are not alternative forms of logic that would be more plastic and adaptable to those purposes. And so in this case, here's an idea. What I would recommend is that if we find that first-order logic is inadequate, not just for talking about theology, but for talking about most things in the world, whether it be like communism and fascism, or whether it be inadequate in talking about vaporwave or about like Taylor Swift, then maybe that's not the best logic we would use to understand the world. And it certainly can't be the logic that we use to understand like the life of the martyrs and the things that people live and die for. So I would suggest that there are more adaptable forms of logic that we need not adopt those same constraints. So in this case, what I would suggest is that the ostensible collapse of logic at the point of incompleteness is an occasion then for reflecting upon the axioms and ground of logic in such a way that logic can be not only continually revised, but should admit for that continual revision in practice. This is the idea that Verlag Karl Alber had, but I think that Karl Alber was merely pointing to the dialectical character of logic from which it could be inwardly reconstituted. So in general, what I recommend in in this book is that Origen had understood logic dialectically rather than merely formally or as a set of finite deductive inferences, and that he recognized that the system of philosophy provided the stable ground in which dialectic could operate at different levels, and in which that argument could be used, but only for the purpose of, as it were, dispelling alternative opinions or advancing some opinions, but never, as it were, for the purpose of simply proving, as it were, the existence of God or coming to know the divine essence. He thought that that had to be something that was sustained by a life of prayer and by asceticism, and ultimately that which was sustained by the entire community of sharing and communicating the gospel as it's been handed down to them.
Okay, thank you.
Petre?
Yes, so if I may, I'm not a professional in theology, but just an amateur who is enthusiastic about this topic. So that's why I'm here today. But my question is whether for Origen there is logic is for him a part of the general revelation, we can say. Am I right? When we have special and general revelation.
So Origen distinguishes between the logos of the gospel, which is that which is received through the scriptures and handed down from the apostolic community, from the logos, what he calls the logos of the Greeks. And now he argues that this is one of the same logos that has informed both, as it were, the Christian community, the apostles, and the Greeks, as well as other peoples who have their own philosophical religious traditions, and that in as far as it's true, it shows us something about the divine logos, so something about what God is revealing to us. So logic for him is obviously an artifact of Greek philosophy. It's not something that you find, there's no like treatise on the syllogism in the scriptures. So, but that being said, in as far as it provides an instrument for coming to know that which is true, an instrument for dispelling false opinions, it can also be an aid to the interrogation of scripture. So in that sense, I would say it's at least a second, if not a third order kind of revelation. It's a kind of revelation, but only a revelation attenuated through a Gentile people, and one that is removed in its history and geography from the historical locus of Christian revelation.
Yeah, so we can say that we have two logics: the logics of the gospel, or the redeemed logic, we can say, and the logic of the pagans, or the natural logic, the fallen or lapsed logic. What about the pre-lapsarian logic, the logic before the fall of man? Does Origen somehow think about this?
Yes, so that's a fascinating question. So what I've argued in the commentary I have given on the section on the angels or the rational beings in On First Principles is that Origen believes that everything that we come to know is in some way created and taught by the angels as an imitation of the divine logos, which contains all that can be known, spoken of, and learned from the beginning, but in a way that has to be, as it were, diffused through the medium of its articulation as it's created in a kind of word-like way among things, and things that can thereafter be the source of human discovery and knowledge. Now, so there had to have been something like logic for the angels, and also Origen suggests that there's a kind of cognitive lapse that is occasioned by a kind of willful neglect amongst the angels. And one can interpret this in a variety of ways. He's never entirely clear on it. One of the words that he uses, as translated by Rufinus, is neglitium or negligence. And so it suggests that there's a kind of, theologians have speculated about this, historians speculated about it. He suggests that there's a kind of fiery heart of love that the angels shared in with God from the beginning, and that some of those angels became negligent or bored with it. And then in their negligence, there's a kind of cooling of their heart, which led to a kind of descent, diffusiveness, spreading out from and away from the locus of divine creation. Now, how that happened had not just to be willful, but also cognitive. And the reason why it had to be cognitive is because Origen insists that each of the angels becomes what they are as angels or messengers. Again, I'm using contemporary parlance. He doesn't use this word. He would use the word rational being. But they become what they are in virtue of how they assume offices, that is, offices in the order of the creation of the world, as well as both its invisible ideas as well as its visible substances. Now how that happens is can't operate in the same way as our logic, because the angels aren't bound by discursive reasoning. They don't, as it were, insert terms that are derived from visible substances, but it must happen in a way that's at least analogous to it. And we might say involves something like the ascending grades of what I've described in hyperlogic, or a logic that draws its ground from its first principles and also ascends back up to them. So this would be a logic at a sort of higher plane of cognition, but one that we have various glimpses of in our own metaphysical reflection, if only dimmed by our corporeal lights.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for the questions. Are there any other questions online? I see some hand. Please.
Oh, yeah. Can you hear me fine?
Indeed.
Yeah. So I was just curious about your framework of having to work more of these things out, and the kind of methodology that might mean. So would that be perhaps something empirical in a certain kind of sense? Like phenomenology, that idea of integrating the first person and the third person, or the subjective and the objective, being very attentive to experience and trying to, as it were, detail knowledge by doing that approach. Does that make sense?
Well, fascinating question. So I do take a kind of phenomenological point of departure from formal logic. So one thing that I note in the posterior genealogy of logic is that one of the decisive ruptures in the history of logic, which frames the so-called analytic computational divide in the 20th century, is Edmund Husserl's critique of Frege in I believe it's Logical Investigations. And there's a specific point here where he argues that pure a priori analytic inferences are inadequate to understand the encounter we have with our own phenomenal experiences. Now, this suggests that another logic is needed, that one that answers to the reality of those experiences, as well as there's a porosity and pregnantness with the possibility of leading to other things and relations that are amplified and can't be captured under kind of univocal syntax. That being said, it doesn't assume a phenomenological method. Rather, it investigates Origen as an historical exemplar who provides us with a way of approaching the questions of, and even scientifically demonstrating them as he proposes, with the use of various logics of which he believes that he has a theological standpoint for critique. So, as I said previously, I'm not sure if you're here for it, there are three sort of parts of this work. There are three courses, and one is historical. So in that sense, the historical point would be the most empirical. It'd be the point of departure where we are looking to Origen as a guide for an historical recollection of the way by which we should use logic for theology. And the second is narrative, that is, it attempts to find a prior posterior genealogy by which we can break the history of logic in light of Origen's intervention, to show Origen not as an accidental figure, but someone essential for discovering how logic is intertwined with, as he says, the Trinity, and the Trinity as the frame for understanding logic not only in its a priori principles, but also in historical development. And then the last two chapters, or chapters 2 and 7 are, 2 and 7 are philosophical critiques on the one hand of a kind of way of reading scripture that would disallow for a logos hermeneutics on the one hand, or Trinitarian hermeneutics, and on the other hand, a purely analytical approach to theology, which would deny in advance that there's anything that theology can add to logic. So I should say I did believe that method can never be separated from the content and the way by which the content shows us what we're hoping to discover within it. I don't believe that we can, as it were, learn how to swim without swimming. So I usually disavow the idea of methodology as something that provides a kind of algorithm for learning. I think that's indebted to a kind of Peter Rameau and to 16th century spatializations of learning that presume that we capture the art of discovery in diagrams, and also to a kind of computational view of learning whereby there are certain algebraic formulas that provide us a sort of royal road to philosophy. And I suggest, to the contrary, that we have to tarry with the uncertainty and the ambiguity of authors, as well as with their mystical insights, often which escape the written word.
Okay, yeah, that's much clearer. Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Many thanks. Is there any other question?
Perhaps from the room we can take questions if there's no other thoughts yet.
Excellent. I have myself a few questions. And they are somehow connected to everything which was already asked, actually. The first thing, I see how you try really creatively to restore a very wide perspective of logics, and how you try to be inspired for this contemporary task by this new reading of Origen. I feel that this is extremely important to look for those alternatives. And this is specifically Christian alternative, Trinitarian alternative, but there are many other alternatives today, so to say. We can, of course, somehow point towards the phenomenological tradition, Heidegger, his critique of logic, das rechnende Denken. But I think there are many other, probably even more creative alternatives than Heidegger's for predicativist Denken. But for example, in Graham Priest, in his contradictory, version of logics in those true contradictions. And I think there are also some proposals how to involve this paraconsistent logic into in theology, in contradictory theology. How would you compare your proposal of this patristically inspired Trinitarian logic to the project of, for example, this contradictory theology, or the project of Graham Priest?
Really, yes. I've written a book review of J.C. Beale's Contradictory Christ, which is a recommendation of contradictory theology that emerges from the ostensible contradiction of the hypostatic union, that God is both passible and impassible, both God and man simultaneously. Now, I think that oftentimes we're inclined to think that theology operates on a plane of myth and of pure contingent will that is in no way related to the inner necessity of reason or science, and for that reason that it can be simply arbitrarily decided in favor of one opinion or the other. So we have a series of options on the menu, whether we want to be Buddhist or Islamic or Mormon or Christian, and any one of them could then be conceived of as the absolute principle that would provide a new framework for understanding logic. Now, I've argued to the contrary, that not only is Christianity something that emerges contemporaneously with the development of classical logic, but also is intertwined with it in its historical development and provides a principle for re-narrating it from its own sources or from its own purposes. And I would be skeptical that you could say something similar or make a coherent genealogy of other claims to revelation and religion. So, for instance, if you were to take Scientology, for instance, in the 20th century, you couldn't possibly say that it had a role to play in the development of logic in antiquity, or that it was essential to the work of Frege or to Leibniz. Whereas you can't say something very robustly about Christianity and how it had informed these currents of thinkers, and also not only they had drawn from it, but also been inspired by it, their community was shaped by it, as well as how maybe their advances in the thinking of logic were animated by certain religious concerns, certain theological assumptions and conclusions that had come down to them from before, and for which they were engaged unwittingly, perhaps, in a kind of theological controversy in their developments in logic. Furthermore, I would like to argue that Christianity, in as far as it has developed in this way, in as far as it's engaged with philosophy and has given birth to philosophy and has collaborated with it in that birthing process, has been a kind of co-mediatrix with the development of logic in such a way that Christianity has assumed the forms of logic within itself, with its own dogmatic interpretation and endeavors. And in this way, we can say that Christianity is not only more philosophical, more logical than other world religions. And that is to say that it's not simply that Christianity is assumed from without, as though it were the optional principle that would give shape to logic, but that Christianity, in the historical course of its development, and also in the way that it's inspired these developments, is itself more logical, as assumed, as it were, formed to its own subject. Now, with regard to Heidegger, I think the challenge of Heidegger is that he breaks so radically from this form of automated learning that he finds in Gottlob Frege as a recapitulation of Leibniz, the Thesis Universalis, that he retroactively attributes that formal amnesia to Plato, the Platonic tradition, and by extension to Christian theology. That is through the Logos theology that vis-a-vis the Stoics came to Philo, and then through Philo to Origen of Alexandria, and thereafter the whole Christian tradition. And arguably this is due in part biographically to his disaffection with the training he received under the Jesuits, his scholastic training, which often allowed him to misidentify the whole inheritance of patristic theology with a kind of false abstract scholasticism that had come down to the present day under handbooks that denied philosophical speculation, and also with the ostensible creativity of the Nietzschean moment in late 19th century Germany that seemed to give birth to an entirely exterior source of renewal that didn't draw from the history of the Christian faith or to its Oriental legacies. And now one can say quite a lot about Heidegger. I've argued that this Heidegger's own anti-formal logic terminates in a kind of a new sophism. And specifically the reason for this is that if one has to, as it were, search for truth as though it's disclosive, as though it comes from a clearing of being or comes from the fourfold in so many ways, in these so many poetic utterances by which we can articulate that, but never know it in such a way that could be the form of both automated and empowered reasoning that remembers and so is able to move faster because it knows what came before, then we don't really have a way by which we can approach anything like the forms of logic, like the syllogism or the production of new knowledge, rather than simply an assembly of things already present to us. That is, we don't have a formal engine of discovery. We merely have of invention. We merely have a kind of hermeneutic of discovery that is always cast in a more poetic mold. Now, with regard to Graham Priest, I've argued in response to J.C. Beale and also in the concluding chapter of my book, in section 8.2, that the fundamental problem, as I regard it with deletheism, is that it misinterprets the problem of remembrance that is framed by the liar's paradox in such a way that it can oscillate between, that is, one opinion or another, whether that the liar says what is true and therefore is false, or is false in saying what is true, or any such contradiction, by attempting to hold them together in such a way that never admits for a third option, or never admits for a tertium quid that stands between those alternatives and is in fact the spring from which those alternative oppositions emerge. And I also have argued that the plurality of logic, which Graham Priest rightly recognizes following Carnap, is something that only exists in an abstract plane of adventitious logical formulations. That is, it only exists insofar as we recognize that each of the functions of logic can simply be posited from the beginning and could be otherwise. So for instance, you could have not simply either true or false, but you could have four positions. You could have true and false, false and false, true and true, and so on. And indeed, you could have any number of different alternatives, as well as any number of inventive logical functions that could inform your use of logic. Now, what has emerged in this discussion of logical pluralism is that there are a certain convergence of types of logic, of which the one that is most widely used today appears to be the most useful in most domains of discourse, and we might privilege some forms of logic in other domains of discourse. And what I've argued is that regardless of what form of logic you choose, as long as the functions and rules of logic are chosen in such a way that it denies some alternative way of speaking, that alternative way of speaking will always creep in at the end, and indeed will always haunt the beginning. So if logic is ultimately incompletable, as far as it has certain axioms and follows those rules in a consistent way, then the incompletable saying beyond what is sayable is always going to be heard from the beginning. So that of which cannot be spoken, we must remain silent, but the silence always haunts everything that you say from the beginning. Yes, and so what I'd argue is that the contradictions of theology can't be considered as an accident or shouldn't be disallowed from the beginning or shouldn't simply be suppressed. I believe that's a kind of vulgar Hegelianism that regards contradiction as though it's a contaminant rather than a spring of knowledge. Rather, I would say that we should recognize contradiction as the very explosivity of thought that is like the Holy Spirit, always that which is fiery and life-giving and which points us in new directions. And I believe this is the authentic way of reading not only Origen of Alexandria, but to another extent also Plato and the dialectical tradition that draws from Plato to the present day. So I think there's another way of thinking about it's another way of answering to the challenge of deletheism, empiricist logic, and that it doesn't require that we stop with contradictions, but it requires that we should hold them to our heart as more essential and the source of new knowledge.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you so much. Are there any questions here in the room?
Maybe I would like to follow up a little bit on Eduard's question, because towards the end of your paper, and thank you very much for that, you mentioned that like one of your ambition is to develop some kind of counter genealogy of Christian thinking, and you somehow situated it against the project of Charles Taylor and
Yes.
So maybe could you explain it a little bit more in
Yes.
detail? What was the idea here?
So I suppose since the dissatisfaction with what was called the secularization thesis in sociology, and also since the movement towards what is called post-liberalism, rejecting a supposed concordance with secular reason, from which religion merely had to provide a kind of complacent correspondence with, that there's been an attempt to find the origins of the suppression or overcoding of religious doctrine that would otherwise disallow it in secular culture, and in the ways by which it seems to silence and move to the margins religious discourse as a subject that could be known to be true. So how do we find the origins of the secular? And that is the historical question that was famously raised by Charles Taylor in A Secular Age, but it's in another way already broached by a number of authors, most notably John Milbank, for whom a different answer is given. So what I had suggested here, and this is you can find in John Milbank's own response to Charles Taylor, is that we can answer this question by pointing, on the one hand, to a succession of reforms, whereby Christianity, in the attempt to overcome its own imperial carapace that had developed since Eusebius and with the imperial papacy of the Middle Ages, had tried to find ways in which it could rediscover its apostolic origins and the vitality that would reshape the world that seemed to be captured under forms of domination and commerce and contract. And so we can look, for instance, to the Gregorian reforms as an effort to sort of renew Christianity from within Latin Christendom, from within the church. But you can also point, and now we're in Moravia and in the Czech Republic, and so it's very timely that you can also point to things like, to moments like Jan Hus's condemnation, which is a sort of tragic moment where this authentic Slavonian liturgy and practice was the source of protest against the church, in which the church violently overreacted and responded in a way that caused a disaffection of the Czech people and ultimately led to a kind of rupture in the Czech Reformation that had to be healed for centuries thereafter by both by force and by assuaging those lasting anxieties. Now, so the question of the secular is in a way also the question of where it is that religious affiliation comes from. That is, in what sense do we suppress the possibility of coming to know that which is holy and divine in a world that disallows for it, that occludes the possibility of knowledge. And in that sense, it can't really be located in any one particular moment in time. You might point to certain pivotal ruptures, and John Milbank has ably expressed this in a very good essay called The Franciscan Charism, and from which he derives his famous Scotus story, whereby Duns Scotus is held to be the architect of the, as it were, the second fall, by which, as it were, the Holy Middle Ages was lost in this sort of disenchanted modernity, where we have a univocal syntax and we have a framework of false knowledge that suppresses true learning and mystical insight. Now, as good as that is, I don't think it goes far enough. So what I'm recommending is something both more archaic and more primordial. So what I'm suggesting is that already in logic, we have the danger of writing in automation. So rather, in writing, we have the possibility that we could be forgetful about the springs of oral discourse and the challenge of answering to that when we speak in person. This is the problem that you find in Plato's Phaedrus, where the god Thuth warns the pharaoh that in granting the art of writing, he's also granting him an occasion by which he can forget all that he had ever spoken of or all that he had ever lived for. In logic, in a way, it's even worse, because if you have an abstract machine by which you can compute in advance what would be the valid conclusion from any premises, then it seems like you can then produce new knowledge from the inserting of any premise you like into it. And it seems as though you no longer need to think, not just need to speak. That is, replace the urgency of speaking and answering to what is written with the possibility of thinking and thinking through, as it were, why it is that certain conclusions follow from their premises. Now, that's an occasion for forgetfulness, but it's not one that need be so long as we remember the origins and purpose of logic. What I suggest has happened very, very quickly is that because of the complexity of logic, it began, arguably by the time of Theophrastus and the Megarians and the Stoics, to be captured in manuals that would teach logic without instructing people as to why it is that logic was conceived of in the first place, or how it is that the various options of logic that were originally on the table for Aristotle had been captured in this single productive form of inferential consequence. And as soon as that happened, I think that we began increasingly to exteriorize our thoughts, to allow for them to be captured in an objective matrix that no longer called upon our own dilemmas and deliberation about how it is we would, as it were, capture the world in forms of mechanical understanding. So I've argued that this is one moment in a sequence of the fall from our sacred recollection of our divine source and origin, as well as our religious destiny, in such a way that we appear to be able to capture the springs of holiness and the springs of life and truth under a simulated matrix of barren forms, as though we were able to dissect a living animal and merely present its bones as though it were the fullness of its anatomy. So I've argued that this is not even unique to Aristotle, and in a way it goes all the way back to the first fall, that is to the fall of the created rational beings from the divine logos, which was their spiritual hearth, and the belief in their prideful domination of the world through their own cognitive mastery, and that Aristotle hadn't fully intended this. He, of course, was simply trying to find a way by which we could show false arguments to be false and true arguments to be true, but in doing so, he gifted the world with a more crystalline matrix by which we could appear to capture the light of truth in abstract forms alone, and thereby to produce something from nothing. And that this galvanized a whole movement thereafterwards, along with Euclidean geometry and the development of algebra, to try to devise a purely formal matrix for the production of knowledge itself, and also the refashioning of the world according to that knowledge. And so you find this you find this in a way expressed in the Renaissance humanists like Peter Rameau. You find it another way expressed in the Radical Reformation, whereby under the written word and with new exegesis of the Bible that is inspired by kind of formalist hermeneutic, that we can recreate God's truth in the image of our own self-understanding, our own assertive self-understanding. And in another way, you find it in figures like Gottlieb Fichte, who, although he would deny it in the atheism controversy, seems increasingly to believe that all society should be under his own tutelage, or tutelage of philosophers who uniquely know how it is they can derive the categories of understanding, as well as the social concepts of that structure the world. And I would argue that logical positivism in the 20th century was yet another expression of that same hubristic will to find a way by which that religious discourse itself could be cast out as nonsense, and the whole of what we answer to as true could be orchestrated entirely under a panoply of empirical evidence on the one hand and analytic deductions on the other hand, or some concert of activity between them. And so I think we face this over and over again in our time. And although a story of a single origin of evil is very tempting, because it allows us to, as it were, cast the blame beyond ourselves to someone in the far distant past or some other time and place, I think that we have to recognize it as a permanent temptation of the way by which we write and the way by which we speak and the way by which we try to think through the world to that which is true.
Excellent. We have maybe time for one or two more questions. So are there any questions online? If not,
I'll go once more, but you can be the first.
Just start.
I would like to ask you, and thank you once more for the great introduction of your book and great lecture. I would like to concentrate on the topics of beauty and goodness. Are they interconnected with the truth, with the logic, either in Origen's or in your interpretation, and in your book? Are they interweaving and in harmony, or separated?
Well, one thing that Porphyry tells us about Origen is that he never stopped reading Plato, that he was a deep admirer of Plato, and when he lists the philosophers who we should read, he lists Plato at the beginning, and also he cites Plato more than any other author in his arguments with Celsus. And he never disavows Plato, and in fact, he seems to present himself as the truest Platonist, precisely because he's also a Christian. And as though that Plato was a proto-Christian, that he were sort of baptized retroactively as most of all a precursor of Christian revelation. Now, the reason I introduce it as such is because beauty is not a theme that one typically finds in Origen of Alexandria. And I'll try to speculate as to why, but it's certainly the case that in Plato, there is a transcendental harmony between beauty and truth. You find this most explicitly stated in the Philebus, where proportionality and truth ultimately converge in the highest good. And that which we desire most of all to be good, we desire to be both beautiful because it's true and more true because it is more beautiful. And in another way, you can find this in Chateaubriand, the genius of Christianity, who argued against Voltaire and Diderot that although we cannot prove Christianity through, I guess, forced order logic or Newtonian mechanics, that Christianity has shown itself to be beautiful in so many ways, and so it's certainly better than the alternative or whatever the cult of the supreme being offered at the time. So now why is it that beauty is not a main source of inspiration for Origen? I would say that Origen, on the one hand, we can say situate this contextually. We can say that Origen is writing in an era in which inner truth and spiritual vigor were considered to be more valuable than outward spectacles of beauty. And so you find in this time and later on in what's called crisis of the 3rd century, a growing disillusionment by artists and public figures with both realistic representations as well as with sublime portraits of the emperors and their vigorous majesty. So you don't find, for instance, the soft curls of Hadrian or the Palace of Tivoli that were celebrating the great inheritance of Greek beauty and all of its sublime and diffuse majesty. So I think that Origen's part of that. It may also be that early Christians, maybe because of their relative social status, maybe because they had not control over the world and they couldn't publicly display because they lived under persecution, weren't as inclined to look upon beauty as they were a symbol of truth. And if that were the case, then it would be that the imperial family or the athletes in the gymnasium or perhaps like the gladiators in the Colosseum, any number of other people could be looked to as images of strength and beauty. And so you lose this close connection between aletheia and arete that you find in Plato or kalos and aletheia. And instead you have a much greater emphasis upon pneuma and gnosis. That is, that the hidden spirit is that which shows that which is to be true. In a sense, it's also like you might say that the gospel militates against that in a certain immediate way. Now, there's certainly a strand that holds that Jesus and Mary were of the utmost beauty and that their divine presence was shown forth. But there's also a counter strand that suggests that they need not have been beautiful. That maybe the hiddenness of God's plan can be manifested through forms that aren't outwardly recognized for their beauty, but only within. So the cross, for instance, is certainly a sign of the most ugly and terrible death. And so it can't be coincident with, it can't be held as a kind of undimmed, bigger image of beauty and splendor within the world. And I guess lastly, what I would say is that there's a kind of apocalypticism in Origen that, although it recognizes the travails that the Christian community will endure in his time and thereafter, and will ultimately involve the breaking of the world as it is and all of its beautiful purportment, it recommends that from the outcome of that broken egg, there will emerge a new life that will be more beautiful than any yet seen before. So perhaps it's for that reason that he doesn't hold to a kind of continuity of beauty that holds to that consistency of proportions and their that which they express in infinite array over time. But he suspects that within the spirit from which it began, for which it's destined to become, that it will be able to become more beautiful than we can yet imagine.
Thank you.
I would like to ask a remark to this topic. What about the commentaries on the Song of Songs? The tradition of commentaries on this book of scripture somehow incorporates a kind of spousal and agape transformation of logic, isn't it so? I think there are many, books written about the genesis of this mystical metaphysics from within this tradition of commentaries on Song of Songs. Is this the case also for Origen?
Well, as far as I know, Origen was the first Christian writer to write a commentary on the Song of Songs. I believe there were Hellenistic Jewish writers who had done so before, but he's the first we have. And he deliberately frames his commentary in contrast to Plato's Symposium on the one hand and others who he doesn't name. So it's possible that he has a similar source in mind. Of course, it assumes a new meaning for Origen than it does previously, because the bride and the bridegroom become an image not of as it were human love and imitation of divine love, but of the love that is shown through Christ in the church, in the way by which the church is presented as the bride approaching the bridegroom, and the various stories in the gospel of bridal marriage become images of supernatural love descending through the various organs of the church and the Christian community. That being said, the beauty of the church, although certainly expressed in the theme of the bride, is not expressed as though it's separate from divine love. So what I would suggest is that, in contrast to Plato, for instance, who's very much concerned with geometrical proportions and the ways by which the vigor of the body can be shown in a beautiful way, and beauty is an occasion for leaping to the divine idea of love, of love itself. Origen of Alexandria is more concerned with how love is witnessed, even in an ugly way. And so I mentioned, for instance, the divine proof of the martyrs, which is a proof not of abstract syllogisms, but with offering their life for their faith. And of course, this is terribly ugly. This involves, as he himself witnessed, like the beheading of his neighbors and his father, or his ultimate torture on the rack before he died in a painful agony shortly thereafter. And so he's not, as it were, I think, deceived by this notion that everything that is beautiful is true and vice versa. He's recognized that there could be truth that endures in spite of the harshness of human life and the way by which we pass through the vicissitudes of the world and all of its misery. And in that sense, he's closer perhaps to the Gothic imagery of Dionysius, whereby he suggests that there are hidden within the shadows and contours and crevices of the world, there can be sparks of glory that we have yet to recognize, and that could be the source of hidden renewal that are not known to the wider world, but are known to the faithful through the eyes of the heart. Now, so I would suggest that what he's most concerned about in the Song of Songs, although I wanted to pass through this very briefly, he famously, and for my purposes, has an excursion on the role of logic in philosophy in the preface of the Song of Songs, in which he describes, and I'll briefly summarize this because you read more about it in the book and elsewhere. He describes how logic is intertwined with the other three sciences of physics, ethics, and apoptics. And apoptics is the word he uses for the more than visible or the mystical science, which is the science ultimately of the three arche, or the principles of theology, as ultimately his systematic theology. So he's using that as a kind of metaphor for, as it were, how through the heart we see more than that which the eye sees. We see the hidden things, and namely the hidden things of the intellectual forms, and ultimately the first principles that are the ground of the forms themselves. Now, so ultimately, I think what he's concerned about is how it is that the love that is shared between one another, between the church and Christ, is something we can also come to know cognitively. But in knowing it cognitively, we do so by not only ascending up to the first principles, but also entering down and moving laterally throughout the Christian community, such that it's something we know not only through the divine logos as the ground of logic, but more expressly by the Holy Spirit as the medium of charity, and charity that unites the whole of the church together. And so the love of neighbor becomes as important as the love of the bride to the bridegroom, or to the love of God. And it becomes the way by which the love of God is manifested throughout the world. And in all of these cases, I think that beauty emerges, but emerges as the byproduct, or as something by which we see the truth that is shown forth in acts of charity and love. So it's not, as it were, the beauty of the latest fashion model, or the most beautiful actress, or the greatest athlete who strikes across the stage, but it's rather the hidden beauty of the nun, or the nurse, or the hospice worker, who in the dimly lit light is caring for people who are grotesque and miserable, and yet enjoying some semblance of divine love through that very act of patience and kindness.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you. Many thanks also for all the interventions from the audience. I think that the questions, and of course the answers, were brilliant, and I almost felt how enthusiastically those questions were provoked by your book, and your exposition of your book. So I think that there is a great need of this kind of reflection. Our session is nearing to the end. We have one more thing. In last months, we have worked actually quite hard to be able to announce today the forthcoming conference called Triertium, which means the connection between the Trinity and all sciences and arts. And this conference will take place in early December, from 3rd to 5th this December 2025, here in Olomouc. And among the speakers, we will have again Dr. Ryan Haecker and figures like Piero Coda, John Milbank, Rocco Buttiglione, Philip Gonzalez, Emanuele Gabellieri, Andrea Bellantone, and many others. For more information about the conference, you can check our website. And I will try to play our video presentation of the conference as the very last thing of our seminary today. Hopefully, it will be possible to share the screen with our project websites. And I will play the video, which is actually invitation and introduction to our project.
I feel that the most important thing about the Triertium project is that it seeks a different form of unity and synthesis of knowledge than we are used to today. All systems of knowledge, when related to the Triune God, are actually personal and relational. As the Father knows himself and everything in the Son, and the Son knows himself and everything in the Father, in the unity of the Holy Spirit.
I think that it's an intensive call to imagine that everything could be different.
Derrière les différentes crises que nous vivons aujourd'hui, il y a une sous-jacente, plus profonde, comme le dit Edgar Morin. Une crise de la pensée, d'où la nécessité de repenser la pensée. La Trinité n'est pas quelque chose d'abstrait, une réalité éloignée quelque part dans les cieux. Elle prend chair dans notre chair.
Is there any place for the Trinitarian mystery in our current political and cultural battles? Isn't it just a naivety of few fools who speak about faded teachings of half-forgotten philosophers and theologians of the past? And moreover, isn't this teaching, as many others before, doomed to become yet another political program or political ideology? It is the incomprehensibility of substantial personal being existing only through the network of relations which impels us to overcome all immanent political ideologies.
La sapienza all'applicazione di una metodologia astratta e la religione ha lasciato il posto ad una libertà intesa come indipendenza individuale totale. Ecco, se noi vogliamo superare il nichilismo della modernità, credo che l'ontologia trinitaria di Campanella e Comenio abbia molto da dire.
The principle of one is always lonely, and the principle of two is always in opposition. We have to take one side or the other. The principle of three is always fertile. It's always dynamic and flexible. It bridges over the dualism.
The Triertium Conference in early December 2025 will gather some of the leading thinkers in today's philosophy and theology to address the internal contradictions in the great systems of human knowledge. I think that the Triertium Conference in Olomouc will show how complex Christian thinking can be.
So many thanks for your attention. Ryan, congratulations to your book.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for this presentation. It was brilliant.
Well, thank you all so very much for coming. I appreciate all those who joined online, and thank you for your questions.
And we wish that we will see each other in December or later. Bye. Goodbye.
Right.